cabin door screamed open. Lantern light spilled across a dirt floor. A human stink rose. It was sickness and damp cloth. His hand lifted the revolver anyway. A blanket pile moved in the corner. A woman's face slipped out of the rags. Her eyes were huge. Her lips were blue. She did not scream. She did not beg. She only stared at him. Then she whispered, "You finally came." Caleb froze because he had come to disappear, not to be expected. How could she be waiting for him? In 1874, Rustwater was mud and whiskey breath. Caleb Rourke rode in with a rifle on his saddle and war noise still trapped in his head. He wanted a place where the wind did the talking and nobody asked his name. Outside the general store, a sweating auctioneer tried to sell a cabin on Crowline Ridge, and the crowd mocked it like a curse. A miner spat and said it was a coffin. Caleb looked toward the peaks and felt relief instead of fear. When the bidding died, he stepped forward and placed 1 silver coin on the barrelhead. $1, he said, voice rusty from disuse. The town laughed, but the auctioneer slammed the gavel and pushed the deed into Caleb's hand. Caleb started up the trail before the sun dropped. At the edge of town, a drunk old man grabbed his coat and hissed, "Do not go alone." Caleb pulled free and said, "Alone is the point." The old man's eyes shone with panic, not liquor. "She is still up there," he whispered. "Waiting." Caleb rode on anyway because he did not believe in ghosts. He believed in cold, stone, and keeping his past behind him. Hours later, the trail leveled, and the cabin appeared on a cliff edge, roof bowed and shutter slamming like a heart. Caleb tied his mare and pushed the door. Darkness met him, and that sour human smell proved the old man had not been lying. He lit the lantern and saw wrecked furniture, snow drifted through cracks, and a cold stone hearth. In the far corner, the blanket pile shivered again. Caleb leveled his Colt and said, "Come out!" A woman eased into the light, thin as kindling, hair matted, cheeks sharp, eyes awake. A rusted skinning knife trembled in her hand, pointed at his chest, but her arm looked ready to snap. She whispered that same strange line again, "You finally came." Caleb kept his voice flat. "I do not know you," Caleb said. "This cabin is mine." She tried to stand, and failed, sliding down the logs with a quiet sound that hit him harder than any threat. Caleb lowered the hammer and holstered the gun, slow and clear. "You are freezing," he said, "and you are starving." "I am fine," she lied, teeth chattering through the words. He pulled jerky and a hard biscuit from his bag and tossed them into the dust between them. "Eat," he ordered, because kindness felt too dangerous to name. She stared like the food might bite her, then hunger won, and the knife clattered to the floor. She tore into the jerky with shaky hands, shame on her face and hunger in her eyes. Caleb turned away, built a fire, and listened to the first crackle, as if it was proof the world could still be gentle. When her breathing steadied, Caleb sat on a crate near the flame and asked, "What is your name?" She hugged the blanket tight and said, "Eliza." Her voice was small, but her gaze stayed sharp. She told him the cabin had been her father's, and he died, owing a heavy debt. Caleb already knew what debt meant out here, and his jaw tightened before she even said the name. "Gideon Harrow," Eliza whispered. She said Harrow wanted more than land, and when the money was gone, he came for her instead. Caleb did not flinch, but his hands clenched in his lap. Eliza said she ran to the ridge because Harrow's hired men feared the climb. Then she said her father told her to wait for a silent mountain man who would hold the line when the wolves came. Caleb was about to call it foolishness, but the mountain spoke first. A rumble rolled under the floorboards. Wind slammed the north wall so hard the cabin shuddered. Dust fell from the ceiling, and Eliza gasped, "The storm!" The main beam cracked like a rifle shot, and the roof sagged under sudden snow load. Caleb shoved Eliza toward the hearth and threw his shoulder under the timber. Pain bit down his spine, but he held. "I need a brace," he gritted. Eliza did not hide. She ripped up a loose floorboard, dropped into a root hole, and shoved up a thick pine post with bleeding hands. Together they wedged it into place until the beams settled and held, and both of them collapsed on the floor, breathing like they had just outrun death. The storm buried them for 3 days. Snow climbed past the window line and turned the room into a dim blue box. They rationed meat, melted snow for water, and fed the fire like it was a living thing. In the long night, Caleb spoke in short pieces about Shiloh, about cannon thunder that still shook inside his skull. Eliza listened without pity, and that quiet respect made his throat burn. She told him about a garden she once dreamed of, wildflowers in front of this cabin, stubborn color in a hard place. One night her hand rested on his forearm, light and unsure, and he did not pull away. The ghosts inside him went quieter, as if they were listening too. On the 4th morning, the wind stopped so sudden it felt wrong. Their food was gone, and Caleb checked his rifle with hands that did not tremble. "Bolt the door," he told Eliza. "I will be back." She nodded once, trust forced into her eyes like a brave mask. Caleb moved through the pines looking for elk sign, but he found something else first. He crouched and brushed snow aside, and an iron horseshoe print stared up at him, sharp and fresh. The wind shifted, and the stink of cheap tobacco slid into his nose. Caleb stood still, blood cooling in his veins. Harrow's men were on the ridge. How long before they reached the cabin, and what would Eliza do if he did not return? Caleb ran uphill until his lungs burned raw. Snow slid under his boots, and branches slapped his coat as he pushed through the pines. He did not hunt now. He listened for men, for metal, for the faint cough of tobacco in cold air. When the cabin broke through the trees, he hit the door hard and shoved inside. The bolts slammed home. Only then did he breathe. Eliza sprang up from the hearth. Firelight caught her face, and she read his fear in one look. Caleb said, "I found horseshoe tracks. Fresh! Harrow's men are up here." Eliza swallowed, but she did not crumble. "How many?" she asked. "I do not know," Caleb said. "Enough." She looked at the door. "Do we run?" Caleb shook his head. "Not in snow this deep. We would paint a trail straight to our backs." He stepped close and kept his voice low. "We stay. We make this place hard to take." Eliza nodded, jaw tight, eyes steady. That steadiness surprised him. It made his chest ache. They worked fast. Caleb dragged the heavy table to the door and jammed it tight. He knocked clay from between 2 logs and cut narrow slits facing the trail. Cold wind hissed through the gaps, but he could see now. Eliza tore her spare skirt into strips and set them near the kettle. "For bleeding," she said. She crushed old glass on the windowsill and smeared bear grease over it. Then she picked up the skinning knife and tested its edge with her thumb. Her face did not soften. She looked like someone who had decided she would not be taken again. The first riders appeared before the sun climbed high. 4 men came out of the timber, spaced apart, rifles across their saddles. Their horses looked better fed than most men in Rustwater. The lead rider wore a red scarf and called out, "We know the girl is in there. Send her out, and you keep the shack." Eliza flinched at the word girl, then pressed her back to the hearth and went still. Caleb did not answer. He rested the Winchester on the log and aimed high. The shot cracked the ridge. The rider's hat flew off and spun into the snow. Caleb shouted through the slit, "Next one is not a warning." For a breath, nobody moved. Then the men dropped from their saddles and dove for rocks and trees. Gunfire answered. Bullets slammed into the cabin and spit splinters into the air. The window cracked and shed a shower of glass. Caleb worked the lever and fired in a steady rhythm. He was not trying to kill yet. He was trying to make them fear the cabin. Smoke curled in the room, bitter and sharp. Eliza stayed low and crawled to him with cartridges in her palm. Caleb reloaded without looking, because he trusted her hands. A bullet punched through a rotten seam and tore his left shoulder. Heat flared, then pain. Then warm blood soaked his shirt. Caleb grunted and kept shooting. Eliza pressed a strip of cloth into his hand and whispered, "Stay up. Stay with me." The riders tried to circle, but the snow slowed them and Caleb's shots forced them back. After a long stretch of noise, the firing thinned. The men pulled away into the trees, not gone, only retreating. Caleb held his aim until the last shape vanished. Then the quiet rushed in so hard his ears rang. The cabin smelled of powder, smoke, and blood. Eliza did not waste a moment. Water boiled in the kettle, hissing soft. She dragged a crate closer to the fire and said, "Sit." Caleb wanted to argue, but his knees shook. He sat. She peeled his coat back and pressed hot cloth to the wound. White pain flashed behind his eyes. He held his breath and did not move. Eliza's hand stayed steady. She brought out a needle and thread from a small pouch and said, "I can stitch." Caleb stared at her. "Where did you learn?" "My mother," she said. "She taught me to mend what gets torn." She stitched him by firelight, close enough that Caleb could feel her breath when she leaned in. Every pull of thread burned, but he stayed still for her. When she finished, she wrapped the shoulder tight with the skirt strips she had torn. Blood marked her fingers. She wiped her hands on her apron and said, "You should sleep." Caleb shook his head. "Not yet." Night settled heavy on the ridge. The shutter thudded, and the wind pushed at the logs like a thing with hands. Caleb sat with the rifle across his knees, eyes gritty. Eliza took the first watch anyway. She crouched near the slit and listened to the dark. Caleb watched her in the fire glow. She was still thin, still tired, but she was not hiding anymore. He reached for her hand, slow, giving her room to pull away. She did not. Her fingers were cold and rough, but they fit his palm. "They will come back," she said. Caleb nodded. "And Harold will come when he is done sending boys." Eliza swallowed, then lifted her chin. "If he comes," she whispered, "do not lose yourself. Do not let him steal your soul along with me." Caleb felt the words settle deep. He looked at the black window where the night pressed close and said, "I do not want to die up here, not with you beside this fire." Dawn came sharp and bright. Caleb was at the slit when he saw the white stallion first. The horse moved clean through the drifts, as if the mountain owed it a path. Gideon Harrow rode it like a man riding into a parlor. Fur at his collar, silk at his throat, gloves pale against the reins. 6 men followed, spread wide, rifles ready. Harrow looked at the cabin with bored disgust and called, "I am finished with this game. Send the woman out." Eliza stepped beside Caleb, close enough that their shoulders touched. She did not hide behind him. Caleb kept the rifle steady but did not fire. He wanted to see the shape of Harrow's plan. Harrow smiled, faint and cold. 2 riders moved forward, holding torches wrapped in oil-soaked rags. Flame danced bright in the morning air. Eliza's breath caught. Caleb's stomach dropped. Harrow lifted a gloved hand and said, "Burn it!" The torches flew through the cold air in slow arcs of fire. They struck the porch roof and burst into bright orange bloom. The old wood did not resist. It drank the flame like dry grass in summer. In seconds, the crackle turned into a roar. Smoke rolled under the door and seeped through the log seams. It tasted bitter and thick. Eliza coughed and pressed her sleeve over her mouth. Caleb felt the heat press against his skin as if the cabin had become a furnace. "Cover your face," he said, tearing cloth from his shirt and tying it across her mouth. He wrapped another strip over his own nose. The beam above them creaked again, not from snow this time, but from fire, eating the strength out of it. The walls that had been their shield were now a trap. Eliza ran to the loose floorboard near the back wall and ripped it up with shaking hands. She pulled out a small tin box and clutched it tight against her chest. "The claim papers," she said through smoke, "proof the land is ours." Caleb nodded once. His eyes burned. He checked the load in his rifle and said, "We go through the front. Stay behind me. Move when I move." Outside, Harrow's men laughed. They thought the fire would do the work for them. They thought fear would drive Eliza running straight into their hands. Caleb kicked the barricade aside and slammed his boot into the door. The burning hinges gave way. The door fell outward into snow with a heavy thud. Smoke poured out in a thick black cloud, swallowing the yard in gray haze. "Now!" Caleb shouted. They burst through the smoke together. For a second, the world was chaos. Flames roared behind them. Snow hissed where embers landed. Harrow's men coughed and cursed, blinded by smoke they had not expected to choke them. Caleb fired from the hip. One hired gun screamed and dropped, clutching his thigh. Another dove behind a tree, rifle slipping from his hand. Eliza stayed low, moving in Caleb's wake exactly as he had told her. Caleb did not waste shots. He wanted one man only. Gideon Harrow tried to wheel his white stallion away from the blaze. The horse reared, eyes wild from the heat. Harrow fumbled for his pistol, silk gloves shaking for the first time. Caleb ran straight at him. The snow dragged at his boots, but rage pushed him through it. He dropped the rifle and leaped. His shoulder slammed into Harrow's chest. Both men crashed into the drift and rolled hard down the slope. Cold bit through Caleb's clothes as they tumbled. He came up on top, fist already drawn back. Harrow's fine coat was torn. His face had lost its color. He smelled of perfume and fear. Caleb's hand wrapped around the silk at Harrow's throat. He squeezed. Harrow clawed at him, gasping, boots kicking uselessly in the snow. The fire roared behind them. Smoke drifted across the ridge like a dark curtain. One punch would end it, one hard strike, and the mountain would swallow Harrow forever. "Caleb!" Eliza's voice cut through the noise. He froze. She stood 10 paces away with a revolver aimed steady at one of the hired guns who had tried to circle them. Her hands did not shake. Her eyes were clear. She was not pleading for Harrow's life. She was guarding Caleb's. "Don't," she said. "He is not worth what it would cost you." Caleb looked down at the man under him. Harrow's eyes were wide now, not cruel, not confident, just afraid. Killing him would be easy. Living with it would not. Caleb released his grip and dragged Harrow up by the collar. He shoved his face into the snow until the silk cravat soaked through. "You like this land," Caleb growled. "You can walk back to town on it." He pulled rope from his belt and bound Harrow's wrists tight behind his back. Harrow struggled, but Caleb tied him firm and fast. The remaining hired men saw their employer hog-tied in the snow and made a choice. They mounted up and rode hard for the valley without looking back. Silence returned in pieces. The cabin burned behind them, roof collapsing inward with a heavy crash. Sparks flew up into the pale sky. The home they had fought for turned to black ribs and smoke. Eliza walked slowly toward the fire. Caleb followed, rope in hand, dragging Harrow behind him like unwanted cargo. She stopped a few yards from the flames and stared at the ruin. Her jaw tightened, but she did not cry. She only breathed in once, long and steady, as if she were memorizing it. "It was never the wood," she said quietly. "It was what we chose inside it." Caleb looked at her, then at the wreckage. The ridge still stood, the sky still stretched wide, the mountain had not fallen. Harrow spat snow from his mouth. "You fools," he hissed. "You think this changes anything?" Caleb pulled him upright and faced him toward the valley. "It changes enough," he said. They waited until the fire burned low. Then Caleb hauled Harrow to his feet and pushed him toward the trail. Eliza walked beside Caleb, tin box held tight against her ribs. The descent was slow. Harrow stumbled often. Snow filled his boots. Pride drained from him with every step. When Rustwater came into view, people gathered at the edge of town, drawn by the sight of a bound man in a fur coat being marched down from the ridge. Whispers spread like wind in dry grass. Caleb did not speak. He walked straight to the sheriff's office and kicked the door open. The sheriff stared at the scene in silence. Eliza stepped forward and placed the tin box on the desk. "Mining claim," she said, "signed before the debt was twisted." The sheriff opened the box and read. His face changed slowly. He looked from the papers to Harrow, then to the crowd pressing in at the doorway. The town that once laughed at a $1 cabin did not laugh now. Harrow tried to speak, but the words fell weak in the room. The sheriff called for irons. When the cuffs closed around Harrow's wrists, a murmur ran through Rustwater. The mighty land baron stood in chains, snow melting off his boots onto the floorboards. Caleb felt Eliza's hands slip into his. It was warm this time. They walked out together, leaving Harrow shouting behind them. Outside, the town watched them pass, not with mockery, not with pity, with something like awe. They had seen a mountain man buy a ruin for $1. They had seen him burn with it. And they had seen what he chose instead of hate. Rustwater did not know what to do with them after that. Men who once laughed at Caleb's dollar bid now tipped their hats when he passed. Women who had whispered about Eliza's disappearance stared at her as if she were something pulled from a legend. The story moved faster than wind through dry grass. A cabin on Crowline Ridge. A fire. A baron dragged down the mountain in rope. Caleb did not stay long in town. He handed the rifle over the counter to have the stock repaired. He bought nails, fresh timber tools, flour, beans, and seed packets Eliza picked out with careful fingers. He ignored the looks. He did not need their approval. The sheriff locked Harrow in a back cell. Word spread that the mining claim was real. Harrow had twisted numbers, forged interest, and bullied half the valley into silence. With proof in hand, even the sheriff could not look away. Justice in that territory was slow, but once it turned, it ground heavy. By afternoon, Caleb and Eliza were riding back up the ridge, with supplies tied tight behind the saddle. The climb felt different now. The mountain no longer seemed like a hiding place. It felt claimed. When they reached the plateau, only blackened beams and stone chimney bones remained. Smoke still curled faint from the ruin. Snow around it had melted into muddy slush. Eliza dismounted first. She walked to the edge of what had been the doorway and stood still. Caleb watched her shoulders rise and fall once. Then she stepped forward and knelt in the soot. She picked up a charred nail and turned it in her fingers. "We build again," she said softly, not as a wish, as a decision. Caleb felt something settle inside him at the sound of her voice. The war had taken his sense of forward motion. He had drifted for years. Now there was direction. They cleared the ruin together. Caleb dragged the heavy beams aside and stacked what wood could still be salvaged. Eliza swept ash from the stone hearth with a broken plank. They worked until their hands turned black and their backs ached. By sunset, the ground stood bare again. Caleb marked new corners in the earth with stakes. He chose a stronger line for the walls, set a firmer footing against the wind. Eliza stood beside him, studying each mark. "You build like you mean to stay," she said. "I do," Caleb answered. The first days were hard labor. Caleb felled straight pine from lower slope and hauled them up with rope and mule strength. His wounded shoulder burned under strain, but he did not slow. Eliza split kindling, stripped bark, and sorted stone for the foundation. Her hands, once shaking from hunger, grew steady with purpose. At night, they slept under canvas stretched between trees. The sky above them was sharp with stars. Wind still moved across the ridge, but it did not howl like before. It sounded almost like breath. Eliza would lie on her back and name the stars she remembered from childhood. Caleb would listen and let the quiet settle in him without fear. The silence no longer felt like a waiting explosion. It felt like room. Weeks passed. Walls rose again. Fresh timber locked tight at the corners. Clay sealed the seams thicker than before. Caleb set beams stronger, braced deep. The roof took shape, firm and steady. This cabin would not sag at the first hard storm. Eliza chose where the front window would face. "Toward the clearing," she said, "so the flowers can see the sun." Caleb smiled without thinking. It startled him. He had not smiled much in 10 years. When the last plank slid into place, they stood back and looked at it. It was not large. It was not fancy. But it stood straight and proud against the skyline. Inside, they built a new table from leftover boards. Caleb carved the legs by hand. Eliza sanded the surface smooth with quiet patience. The hearthstones were reset firm. When the first fire burned in the new cabin, the smoke rose clean and true through the chimney. It smelled of fresh pine and hope. One afternoon, while Caleb was setting a final shutter hinge, he heard the steady rhythm of digging outside. He stepped down from the ladder and walked around the side of the cabin. Eliza knelt in the dirt of the clearing. Snow had long since melted. Green moss crept over rock edges. The earth was dark and rich where the fire had once scorched it. She pressed seeds into the soil one by one. Bluebells, Indian paintbrush, wild asters. Her fingers moved, gentle and sure. Caleb stood watching her for a long moment. The wind lifted her hair and carried the scent of turned earth and pine sap. She looked up and caught him staring. "You gonna stand there all day?" she teased lightly. "Or help me?" Caleb stepped down into the clearing and knelt beside her. The dirt felt warm under his palms. He did not know much about flowers, but he knew how to protect something fragile. They worked side by side in silence, not the heavy silence of strangers. The kind that comes when two people trust the space between words. Weeks later, a wagon creaked up the lower ridge. Caleb saw it first and rested a hand near his rifle out of habit. But the wagon did not carry hired guns. It carried townsfolk. The blacksmith. The schoolteacher. Two miners whose claims had once been tangled in Harrow's greed. They climbed down with tools and spare boards. The blacksmith cleared his throat and said, "Heard you might need a hand finishing that fence." Caleb looked at Eliza. She raised one brow and smiled faintly. "Would not refuse it," Caleb said. They worked through the afternoon, raising a sturdy fence around the clearing. Laughter carried over the ridge for the first time in years. No one mocked. No one whispered. When the wagon rolled away at dusk, the fence stood solid. The town had not just witnessed a fight. They had witnessed a choice. And choices have weight in a place like that. Later that evening, Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out the crinkled deed, edges stained by smoke and snow. He handed it to Eliza. She turned it over in her hands and smiled at the inked price. $1, she said softly. Caleb nodded. "Best trade I ever made." She folded the paper and pressed it back into his palm. "You did not buy a ruin," she said. "You bought a reason." The sun dipped low, painting the ridge in gold. The new cabin stood firm behind them. The fence marked their claim. The soil waited for bloom. Caleb slipped his hand into hers. The mountain wind moved around them, no longer biting. Just steady. Just home. Spring settled slow over Crawlin Ridge. Snowmelt carved bright lines down the slopes. The moss thickened on the rocks. The wind lost its bite and carried the smell of pine and damp earth instead of ice. The cabin stood firm against the skyline, new timber pale against the dark trees. Caleb rose before dawn most mornings. Old habit. He would step outside and scan the ridge with quiet eyes, not because he expected trouble now, because guarding something had become part of him. Eliza would follow soon after, shawl wrapped tight, hands already thinking of the garden. The first green shoots broke through the soil in early May, small, stubborn things pushing through ash and stone. Eliza knelt beside them, as if greeting old friends. "See," she whispered one morning, touching a fragile stem, "it remembers how to grow." Caleb stood behind her, watching the slope where the old cabin once burned. He remembered the fire, the smoke, the sound of gunshots rolling across snow. It felt distant now, like a dream that had finally ended. Word reached them from town that Harrow's case was moving forward. The mining claims were being reviewed. Men who once feared him now spoke openly. The sheriff had found forged notes and false interest tallies stacked deep in Harrow's office. The valley shifted. It did not cheer loudly. It did not throw parades. It simply breathed easier. One afternoon, a rider approached the ridge alone. Caleb saw him from the fence and rested a hand on the rail. The rider dismounted near the clearing and removed his hat. It was the old drunk from town, only he did not look drunk now. His coat was cleaner. His eyes were steady. "Name's Samuel," he said, clearing his throat. "Figured I owed you both something." Caleb said nothing, but he did not send the man away. Samuel looked at the new cabin, then at Eliza tending flowers. "I warned you," he said quietly. "Did not think you would actually listen." Eliza stepped forward and studied him. "You were the only one who told the truth," she said. Samuel nodded once. "Harrow hurt my brother years back, took his land the same way he tried with yours. We were too scared to fight." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small cloth bundle. Inside were 3 silver coins. "For the trouble," he said, "and for dragging that snake down the ridge." Caleb shook his head. "Keep it." Samuel hesitated, then tucked the coins away again. He looked at the flowers sprouting in neat rows and smiled faintly. "Never thought I'd see color up here," he murmured. When he left, he walked straighter than he had the day Caleb first met him. Summer warmed the mountain. The garden bloomed in patches of blue and red. Wildflowers dotted the clearing like scattered paint. Eliza moved through them with quiet pride, trimming, watering, coaxing stubborn roots deeper. Caleb built a small shed near the tree line and stacked cut wood for winter. His shoulder scar tightened in damp weather, but it no longer burned like it once had. The pain felt like a reminder, not a wound. At night they would sit on the porch steps and watch the valley lights flicker far below. Rustwater looked small from that height. "Do you miss it?" Eliza asked one evening. Caleb shook his head. "No." She studied him. "You used to look at the valley like it was the world." "It was noise," he said after a moment. "This is quiet." The quiet did not scare him anymore. Late one afternoon, the sheriff himself rode up the ridge. He dismounted with slow care and removed his hat. Caleb stepped forward, cautious but calm. "It's done," the sheriff said. Eliza came to stand beside Caleb. "Harrow's been sentenced. Prison down in the territory line. All properties seized. Claims restored where they could be proved." Eliza's fingers tightened around Caleb's hand. "And the rest." "Rest will take time," the sheriff admitted, "but his hold on this valley is broken." He glanced at the garden and then at the cabin. "Town owes you both more than it can say." Caleb shrugged. "We did what needed doing." The sheriff nodded and left them with the news hanging in the warm air. That night the ridge felt lighter. Caleb lay awake beside Eliza, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing. He turned his head and watched moonlight spill across the ceiling beams. For years he had searched for a place to end his wandering. He had thought he wanted silence without witness. Instead, he had found silence shared. He reached for Eliza's hand in the dark. She squeezed back without waking fully. Weeks passed into full summer. The fence held strong. The shed filled. The flowers spread wider than Eliza expected. Bluebells leaned against the path. Indian paintbrush caught the sun like small flames. One morning, Caleb stepped out and saw Eliza standing at the edge of the clearing, hands resting lightly over her stomach. She looked different, not fragile, not hunted, steady. She met his eyes and gave a small smile that carried both wonder and fear. Caleb felt his breath slow. The mountain air tasted new. He walked to her and placed his hand gently over hers. Neither spoke for a long moment. The ridge stood silent around them. The wind moved soft through the pines. The cabin, once ash and smoke, now held something far stronger than timber, a future. Caleb looked down at her and said quietly, "We will hold this line." Eliza nodded. And for the first time in his life, Caleb did not feel like a man running from ghosts. He felt like a man building something that would outlast them both. Mountain summer did not last forever. By late August, the nights cooled again. Wind came down the peaks with a warning edge. The first thin frost showed on the fence rails at dawn. Caleb felt it in his shoulder scar before he saw it on the ground. Eliza moved slower now. Not weak, just careful. She still worked the garden, but Caleb caught her pausing more often, palm resting over her belly like she was guarding a secret flame. One morning she sat at the table and pushed her breakfast away. Her face had gone pale. Caleb set his cup down. "What is it?" Eliza looked up at him, eyes clear, voice steady. "We need a midwife, before the snow comes." The words hit Caleb like a sudden quiet after gunfire. His breath held. His hands went still. For a moment he only stared at her, trying to understand what his heart already knew. Eliza reached across the table and touched his wrist. "I was scared to say it out loud, like the mountain might hear and take it away." Caleb swallowed hard. The fire popped behind him. He nodded once, slow. "We will be ready." He did not say more, not because he did not feel it, because the feeling was too big for simple words. That same day he saddled the mare and rode down to Rustwater. The town looked different now, less muddy, less hungry. Men stood straighter. Harrow was gone, and without his shadow the valley had begun to breathe like a man waking from a long sickness. Still, heads turned when Caleb rode in. He was the mountain man who bought a cursed cabin for $1. He was the one who dragged Gideon Harrow down the ridge in rope. People did not laugh at him anymore. They watched him like a story walking on two legs. Caleb went straight to the general store and asked where to find Mrs. Lottie Henshaw. The clerk blinked and pointed him toward a small house near the creek. Lottie opened her door with flour on her hands and suspicion in her eyes. Then she saw Caleb's face and her expression changed. "You are the man from the ridge," she said. Caleb nodded. "I need help for Eliza." Lottie studied him for a long moment. Then she wiped her hands on her apron and stepped back inside. "Wait here." When she returned, she carried a leather satchel and a folded quilt. "You ride me up there, now, and do not argue with me." Caleb did not argue. The ride-up was slow. Lottie was not young, but she held steady in the saddle. She asked no foolish questions, only watched the trail like she had walked harder ones in her time. When they reached the cabin, Eliza was on the porch step, breathing careful. Relief softened her face when she saw the satchel. Lottie stepped down and went right to her. She touched Eliza's wrist, then her cheek, then looked into her eyes. "You have been through worse than this," she said. "But you will listen to me anyway." Eliza gave a small smile. "Yes, ma'am." Caleb stood back, hands tight at his sides, feeling useless for the first time since the war. He could fight men. He could face storms. He could haul logs until his bones ached. But he could not do this for her. The first pains came 2 nights later. Wind rattled the shutter. The sky outside was black and heavy with cloud. Eliza gripped the bedpost and breathed through it. Lottie moved like a calm shadow, boiling water, laying cloths, speaking low and firm. Caleb fed the fire until sweat ran down his back. At one point, Eliza reached for his hand. Her fingers were slick with fear and effort. Her eyes locked on his like a vow. "Do not let me go alone," she whispered. Caleb shook his head hard. "Never." He stayed at her side until Lottie pushed him back with a sharp look. "Give her room," she said. "And give her faith." Hours passed in a blur of firelight and breath. Outside, the first snow began to fall. It tapped the roof soft, then harder, like the mountain trying to speak again. Then a sound rose in the cabin that Caleb had never heard in all his years of drifting. A small cry, thin at first, then stronger. Lottie lifted a bundled shape into the firelight. "A boy," she said, voice warm with triumph. Healthy, loud, stubborn. Eliza was crying now, quiet tears that looked like relief more than pain. Lottie laid the baby against her chest. Caleb stepped closer, slow, as if he feared the air might break. Eliza looked up at him, hair damp on her brow, face pale but shining. "Come here," she said. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the tiny red face, the clenched fist, the trembling breath. The baby opened his eyes for a second, unfocused, then shut them again like the world was too bright. Caleb's throat tightened until it hurt. His hand hovered, unsure. Eliza guided his fingers to the baby's back. "He is real," she whispered. "We are real." Caleb nodded, but no words came. In that moment, the war finally loosened its grip. Not all at once, not like a door slamming, more like a knot untying, strand by strand, until he could breathe again. The next week, Rustwater climbed up to the ridge. Not all at once, one wagon at a time. First, Lottie's husband brought fresh milk and a sack of oats. Then the blacksmith arrived with a new latch for the door. Then the schoolteacher came with 2 small shirts she had sewn, cheeks pink with shyness. They did not come to stare, they came to help. And yes, they were shocked. They had expected a lonely mountain man to die in that cabin. They had expected the ridge to stay cursed. Instead, they found a home, a garden, and a woman who had survived, standing with her baby in her arms like she had always belonged there. Caleb watched them from the porch, feeling something strange in his chest. Not pride, belonging. One afternoon, Eliza stood in the garden with the baby wrapped tight, bluebells nodding near her boots. She looked up at Caleb and smiled. "You still keeping that deed?" she asked. Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out the old paper, creased and stained and precious. "Always." Eliza nodded toward the flowers. "Then keep it, so one day he knows how it started." Caleb looked down at the baby, then at the ridge, then at the cabin that had once been ash. He took a slow breath of pine and clean, cold air. He had come here to vanish. He had stayed to protect. Now he would stay to build, because the mountain did not feel like a grave anymore. It felt like the safest place on earth.